Looks like everyone's able to connect okay. I'll go ahead and start things off. Good morning. You've joined the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Boards, or the CSB's business meeting. We will now begin this meeting with Dr. Catherine Lemos, the chairperson and CEO of the CSB.
So welcome, and thank you to everyone that has joined our second quarterly business meeting for fiscal year 22. And from now on, I'll say FY for all those who are not used to using fiscal year, but FY22. I believe these meetings are a great opportunity to provide an update on CSB activities and progress. So today I'm joined virtually, not just by our host who has graciously introduced us and will walk us through this meeting. Bruce Walker, our senior advisor, is on the line. David Lacerte, our executive counsel, senior advisor, and acting managing director, as you may or may not see right now, but he's joining us. Thank you, David. Stephen Kleist, our executive director of investigations and recommendations, and Chuck Barbie, our director of recommendations. So allow me to first summarize the mission of the CSB. I like to start by reminding everybody what that mission is. We are an independent, non-regulatory federal agency with a mandate to investigate accidental chemical releases at fixed facilities with significant impact to the safety of on-site workers, community members, and our environment. The investigations examine and evaluate a wide range of aspects to include equipment and system design, regulations, industry standards and guidance, training, operations and procedures, and human and organizational factors. With these facts, we conduct analysis to determine the probable cause and contributing factors so that we can better understand not just what happened, but why. And from there, we issue safety recommendations for the purpose of preventing the likelihood and the consequence of similar incidents in the future. So the purpose of today's business meeting is to provide stakeholders and the general public with insight and transparency into the business of the CSB in meeting our mission. Now, during our previous business meeting in October, I went into a lot of detail regarding how we're defining business versus board meetings. And if you'd like more of that description, you can refer back to that meeting. In short, both are public in nature, which is why you have the notice, perhaps if you received it, say a public business meeting, but we can have a public board meeting. Business meetings are focused on business and performance metrics, and board meetings are focused on the review, the discussion, and board voting and finalizing a safety product, such as an investigation, but we have other safety products that we have put out and we will continue to with the board's full vote. All meetings where a quorum of board members convenes for the official business will be held according to the Sunshine Act and accessible to the public moving forward. I will repeat some of the things that you've heard me say many times if you've been watching our interactions and engagements. Transparency is our priority. So whereas in the past we haven't held public votes as an agency, or many votes weren't held publicly, or for others to watch the process, I have committed to all of our votes as a board to be public and accessible to the public. And as of now, they're virtual, and I'd like in the future, at some point when we can reconvene in a public space. All these meetings, though, are recorded and available on the website for later review. So there is a site on the CSB government public site where you can go and watch these past events and what was said. Before we had video set up, we did have transcripts, so that's where you have that. And we continue to request comments from stakeholders and the general public at our agency email at public@csb.gov. And I want to thank Hillary and her team and others that manage that and get back, because I'm positive there are quite a few requests that come in and comments that come in. And we have some that we received for today's meeting that will be addressed throughout the course of the agenda. So allow me to walk through today's agenda. So now that I've reviewed what the purpose and the mission of the CSB is and the purpose of this meeting, I'll start by providing a status of the new board members that will join us, 2 new board members very shortly. We will then hear from Managing Director Lacerte, who will provide some critical administrative and strategic updates that impact the agency's performance. Executive Director Kleist will review our plan for completing open investigations provided to our Oversight Committee at the end of FY21 or fiscal year 21. Although we talked about it in October, he's going to go into more detail. And through this compressed schedule, I say compressed because it is forward-leaning. This is more than we've ever done as an agency in any fiscal year. To clear a backlog, this shows our strong commitment to performance. And I thank you, Executive Director Kleist, Managing Director Lacerte, and all of the support staff and investigators required to make this happen. It is a team effort. Director Barbie and recommendations will present some newly developed summary statistics for recommendations. I'm really excited about this. These statistics clearly highlight the success of CSB in meeting our mission through recommending and advocating for positive safety change. Through this data, he will reinforce why safety recommendation status change is a key indicator of performance for our agency. Now, obviously, we couldn't do this without the investigators, but this is something that once we have the recommendations voted on out of a safety product, not always an investigation, but most usually, we need to follow up on that, not just lay it dormant. What we'll show you today, what Director Bible will show you, will continue to build on these newly developed metrics and plan to include this as a routine segment in each of our quarterly business meetings. So although the board voted on a set of recommendations in October, I have decided to hold off on the mounting number of recommendations that Director Barbie and his team have made progress on until the new board members join, because I believe it is valuable to have their input. Thank you, Director Barbie. When I say mounting, I described this morning that I'm like a racehorse. I am dying to get performance. I'm dying to get those out, but I believe that the additional input of our new board members will be critical to adding perspective to those votes. So I look forward to having our 2 new members. So FY22, or fiscal year 22, between investigations and recommendations, promises to be a year that surpasses performance in all areas. That includes hiring, that includes revamping of support staff needed to make this happen. And I thank staff for their investments and their intellect in bringing us to this critical point in the history and in the future of the CSB. Now, comment regarding our board members in the queue. And I say in the queue because it's not as easy, as simple as some people might imagine, right? You're confirmed by the Senate, which you rarely get notice advance, but we're planning for this and we're excited about it. The agency is really looking forward to the onboarding of our 2 new board members that were confirmed by the full Senate in December. Their names are Sylvia Johnson and Steve Owens. And I trust that they're online today listening to this. They said they would be. Our human resources business partner, their name is IBC. They're part of the Department of Interior, as you'll hear this a little bit later. They're our business partner so that we can have contracts to extend the reach of our support staff. They have a goal of completing onboarding for these new members next week, at which point they will be sworn in. And when they're sworn in, they're seated to start their duties as employees of the agency. So again, although I could have voted on things prior, I knew it was imminent, and I believe their additional input and perspective is going to add to the value that we bring to the community. So with that, I'll let you know we'll send out a press release as soon as they've been sworn in. Like there will not be a moment of delay. Everybody is waiting on bated breath. And we thank President Biden. I really do want to thank the current administration for nominating new members. And we thank the Senate for their duty and the consideration of those members for confirmation. Additional perspectives, backgrounds, and specialties will serve to strengthen our agency. And I look forward to working with them. And as I mentioned earlier about recommendations and especially investigations, we have so much to accomplish. So we have a lot to really bring these board members up to speed. And someone will discuss that a little bit later. With that, I will now turn the meeting over to Acting Managing Director of the CSB. So Mr. CSB, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman. As the Chairman stated, I am David Lacerte. I serve as the Senior Advisor and Executive Counsel, and I'm also continuing to fill in as Acting Managing Director. I'd first like to note that we are poised to begin another round of investigative hiring next week, and we have completed onboarding for 2 new investigators since our last meeting in October. All postings will be on the USA Jobs website. We encourage all stakeholders to share and circulate our recruiting efforts so that we can fill our positions with a broad and diverse cross-section of investigative staff. I'd also like to note that our mission staff, to include investigators, are now being recruited and filled as nationwide postings with remote work availability. This will allow our investigative ranks to be filled from larger applicant pools, will better position the agency to meet diversity and inclusion goals, and will allow for geographic diversity to better meet our mission and respond more quickly to chemical incidents. We currently have an opportunity for a Chief Information Officer, which is currently posted at USA Jobs. And we will also be hiring for multiple recommendation specialists in the coming months. These professionals are key to moving recommendations forward toward closure and for advancing chemical safety. As we are now in calendar year 2022, the agency is currently operating under the federal continuing resolution as authorized by Congress. While this is sufficient to meet our mission, we're beginning to advocate for our FY23 budget request, which contains a modest increase in funds as we ramp up staffing and operate with our new board members. If our budget requests are advanced by appropriators, this will allow the agency to reach an all-time high for mission staff by the end of fiscal year 23. As the Chairman stated, we're very grateful for the bipartisan support which we receive from our partners in Congress. We did receive one public comment prior to today's business meeting. The American Gas Association has sent a letter asking for confirmation that pipeline incidents are not included in the framework of the mandatory reporting rule found at 40 CFR section 1604.3a. The CSB looks forward to continuing the dialogue with the AGA so that we can meet our mutual missions in the safest manner possible. We can look forward to addressing these in further detail in the coming months. Finally, you can expect 2 new safety videos to be released this quarter, outlining the investigative reports, findings, and recommendations from our recently closed files, AB Specialty Silicones and Evergreen. As we complete more investigations in the future, it will often be accompanied by a video which drive the message home in a graphical and easy to understand fashion. As you can see, we're making great strides here at the agency and with our mission. We know this impacts stakeholders across the government, industry, the workforce, and with a number of non-governmental organizations. We are happy to enjoy bipartisan support, but we absolutely must increase output. As we do so, the agency looks forward to continuing our dialogue on how to achieve our mutually beneficial outcomes with all stakeholders and partners. As always, we look forward to providing the public with these updates, and comments are always welcome at public@csb.gov, which we will attempt to address at each public meeting. I can also be personally reached at david.lacerte@csb.gov if anyone would like to discuss a matter personally. I want to thank Dr. Lemos for the opportunity to serve, and I thank all of our CSB staff again for their hard work and dedication to our agency and to our mission. I'll now hand the meeting over to Executive Director of Investigations and Recommendations, Mr. Steve Kleist. Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Lacerte. I'd like to again highlight the postings for our new investigator positions, which should be on USA Jobs next week. We hope to select 3 mid-career investigators from this applicant pool, and we encourage all of our partners to share this opportunity to join the CSB in furtherance of our mission of safety. As Mr. Lacerte mentioned, these positions are remote eligible and recruiting will be nationwide. I'd like to recognize one of our departing investigators, Samantha Barton Fullerton. Ms. Fullerton has demonstrated a high level of professionalism during the past year, working on a very important investigation, and I wish her the best of success as she moves on to her new opportunity. She will certainly be missed within our organization. Next, I would like to discuss our ongoing investigation closure plan. To increase the CSB's transparency, we will be posting an open investigation calendar on our website of our anticipated schedule to complete open investigations. This information will be updated quarterly as we hold these business meetings. The decision criteria for the completion of investigations is based on the ability and urgency to affect safety, the technical complexity of the incident, the amount of time to recover, inspect, and conduct testing of critical evidence, as well as the availability of investigative staff. This would put us on track to close all current investigations within this 2-year timeframe and would exceed the performance of the CSB at any point since our inception. The current plan is aggressive and would involve the agency adding to our goal of completing as many as 11 investigations in fiscal year 22. This assumes flexibility in the order of completion based on factors outside of our control, such as unsafe condition of the site structure, site contamination, or if we identify a high priority incident that is ready for release or needs to be moved up in the queue. This plan prioritizes the completion of older investigations, moving into fiscal 23. All open incidents occurring prior to calendar year 2020 would be completed. Finally, I'd like to recognize our outstanding efforts to close safety recommendations over the past year. Our recommendation staff works hard to take the recommendations from our investigations and implement them into the industry with the regulators, with the state and local governments in order to impact positive safety change. I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Director of Recommendations, Charles Barbie. Mr. Barbie will provide a presentation on the performance of the agency's recommendation program. Director Barbie, please proceed.
Thank you, Executive Director Kleist. So in case you weren't aware, I'm going to go ahead and say, spoiler alert, the presentation I'm about to deliver is going to be a recommendations program success story. Before I deliver it, I wanted to make sure everyone is aware that all the recommendations that we issue stem from investigations that our investigators spend countless hours drafting and revising after spending weeks and weeks of their time in the field. So in short, the recommendations program is solely dependent upon that investigation program. As a result of all that work, as well as the time that the investigations and recommendation staff spend together developing safety recommendations, we within the Office of Recommendations do our absolute best to make sure that every one of those recommendations are acceptably implemented. Now, it doesn't always happen, but I think you're going to find here in a few minutes that it does most of the time. And with that, I'll go ahead with my presentation. So we're going to talk about the recommendations program performance and some other information that we analyze. Next slide, please. To start out with, we're going to talk about our performance over the past fiscal years, particularly fiscal year 2021 and fiscal year 22 to date. These are our closed recommendations. So let's go down to the bottom. We're going to start in fiscal year 20. Keep in mind, we've got the backdrop of COVID that has hit the federal government as well as the rest of the United States. So as a result of that, some of our numbers were low while we're trying to sort of make sure our infrastructure is working as it should and that kind of thing. So that particular year, we closed a total of 8 recommendations. 7 of those were closed acceptable. And when I say acceptable, there's 3 statuses that fall under that. And you'll actually see those on the next slide, but to sort of tell you up front, those are anything with closed acceptable action, closed alternate acceptable action, and closed exceeds recommended action. So that those 3 things, basically you get a positive outcome, they fall underneath acceptable. Closed unacceptable, we had 1 of those that year, and unacceptable is just that. It's either they didn't do it or they never communicated with us. It's one of those 2 things. And we've got that other category, reconsidered or no longer applicable. And I'll get into the details of that later as well when we get to that slide. But that particular year, we had 0 of those. So then fiscal year 21, if you look at all of our performance reports for the CSB since I've been here, that is the highest number of closed recommendations that we've had. So yet last fiscal year was outstanding for our program. We had 28 acceptably closed recommendations, which is, of all those recommendations, 68% of them were acceptable. 10 were unacceptable, and then 3 were reconsidered or no longer applicable. And then this fiscal year to date, we've closed 16, 9 acceptable, or 6% of them, 5 unacceptable, and 2 reconsidered or no longer applicable. Now, if you take that 1 quarter that we did last year, which is where all these were closed, and you extrapolate that moving forward, it looks like fiscal year 22 is going to be another outstanding year for the program. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to talk about the total recommendations in general and the breakouts of those. So to date, the CSB has issued 861 recommendations. So of those 861, 103 are open, 758 are closed. So 12% open, 88% closed. And that's actually been a very high number for a long period of time, I would say. And you know, we have the opportunity to I'm shooting for that 90%. I've been shooting for that for a long time. So when we hit that, the next time I come out, I'll be doing backflips and all kinds of amazing things. But that's the goal that I'm shooting for, and my staff and I are driving very hard for. So let's talk about open recommendation statuses, that 12% piece, which is why the little arrow points from the 12% to the smaller pie chart. We've got 3 statuses that fit under open. The first status is awaiting response or evaluation. And just so you know what that means, that's okay. The recommendation or the investigation has been approved by the board. We've issued, let's say, 5 recommendations, or in this case, we'll say 22 recommendations, because that's the actual number. And we haven't had a response yet from the recommendation recipient. Or in the case of a regulator or a standard developing organization, we're waiting for a draft of that information. So those things sit in that waiting status until we get those things, some kind of response saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to implement it. It's going to look like this. This is the proposed timeline, and here's the point of contact. So while it's waiting, That's awaiting. Acceptable response or alternate response is basically, acceptable response or alternate response is basically they said they're going to do it. This is the timeline that they're going to do it within, and that gets an acceptable response from us. And then unacceptable response. Typically, what we hear is that we're not going to do it. Here's why, or they haven't. They haven't bothered to respond. Either and when that happens, like we call, we email, we send letters. We do it's not like we send a letter and we sit and wait. We do all kinds of proactive types of communication to try to establish some kind of communication there. But if we don't get it, then we propose to the board that they change the status to unacceptable. So if we break those out, say 21% of all the open recommendations, we're waiting on that response, or we're waiting on some sort of draft document from the standard developing organizations or regulators. 13% of those are unacceptable, which is fortunately is a very low number. And that's of that 12%. So 13% of open recommendations are unacceptable. They're saying we're not going to do it. And the vast majority, as you can imagine, 66%, they come back and say, yes, we're going to do it. This is the timeline. And so that's part of our success story. Next slide, please. All right, now we're going to talk about the closed recommendations. And that's why we pulled, if you look at the pie chart, we pulled that open little piece out. But of all the recommendations issued, these are the percentages. Acceptable, as you see, that's 73% of the recommendations, of all the recommendations we have are closed acceptably. 46% are closed unacceptably. Or not 46%, I'm sorry, 5%, much better number, 5%. And then 10% are closed in an other category. That other category is reconsidered, superseded, or no longer applicable. I'm going to go ahead and explain that now. Reconsidered, superseded. Sometimes a recommendation recipient comes back with an explanation as to why that recommendation may not be appropriate either for them as the recipient, or there's some other argument that the board agrees with. And we take, whenever we get a no, we look at what they say very, very critically and very, very seriously. And like I say, as you can see by the numbers, we've done 23 in our history. We do to give it consideration. And so, nobody likes to say that they're wrong, but sometimes either we're wrong or, like I say, something has happened and the board agrees with it, that that is no longer appropriate for that recipient to implement that rec. Superseded. What that means is, okay, the same or we've had an incident, we've got the same recommendation recipient and basically the same recommendation, but there's a modification we need to make to the recommendation. At that point, we close the open and we open up the new one, and the one that's closed is closed superseded. And that's what that means. And then we've got no longer applicable. No longer applicable means some situation has happened, typically where that recommendation recipient can no longer or should no longer implement the recommendation. Typically what that happens is when a facility shuts down or something like that. So basically it renders the situation moot. And as I said before, closed, I'm gonna go back up to the top because this is a much better story to tell. Closed acceptably. 3 categories under that: exceeds recommended action, acceptable action, or acceptable alternative action. I'm gonna start with the one in the middle, acceptable action. What that means is they did exactly what we asked them to do. They hit the bullseye. That's what we want. Acceptable alternative action. That means they met the intent of what the CSB wants, or got most. Let's say, we've got 4 or 5 parts to this thing. They hit 4 of the 5 parts. The 5th part is not as significant, something along that lines. It tips us into the acceptable alternative action realm. And we have the ability to close it that way. Didn't do exactly what we said, but pretty close and met the intent. And then The diamond at the top, the pinnacle, is exceeds recommended action. That means they did what we asked them to do and more, or so much better. That can happen by doing exactly what we said in just an amazing short amount of time, or they've got some innovation that they've done, that they've implemented, or they've done 10 or 11 or 12 more things than what we asked them in that same category or group. Basically, they've just done a phenomenal job. We want to recognize them for it, and that's what we apply. So, like I say, the big thing to take away from this on the closed recommendation side is of all the recommendations issued, 73% of those are some form of acceptable, and that's one of the, like I said, one of the numbers that drives that success of the program. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to break it down just by grouping all the closed recommendations together. So when we do that, what we've got are 83% of them fall into the acceptable category, and 17 fall outside of that. And when we break them down further, 91% of them are acceptable action, 6% of them are exceeded recommended action, and 3% of them are acceptable alternative action. So these are all the success side of the house. This is where the rubber meets the road. This story right here says we are driving critical safety change in partnership with our recommendation recipients. Next slide, please. Now here's the other side of that coin, unfortunately. Like I say, unacceptably means they either aren't going to implement or they just never responded to us at all. But if you look in all the closed recommendations, that is only 6%. Looking at the 94%, that's a solid A. And that's what I tell my girls when we talk about percentages. So that's just a very small percentage. I wanted to make sure everybody saw that. Next slide, please. And then we've got this other category that I talked about a few minutes ago: reconsidered, superseded, or no longer applicable. Of all the recommendations we've closed, 84 of them fall into that category. And so that's 11% of the closed recs. And that's broken up between the two under closed. 27% of those are reconsidered, superseded, and 73% are no longer applicable. And that's sort of the breakdown. Next slide, please. One of the other things we want to say is if anybody has data needs on our recommendations, we have several different categories in which we break down our data. We've got by investigation, we've got by status, open, close, the various, and which you just saw the presentation on. We've got recommendation purpose. We've got recipient type. And so one of the pie chart that I put before you is that's about recommendation purpose. Every one of the recommendations we issue, we actually have to choose why did we issue that recommendation, what kind of recipient was it, and dates and various other things. And so that's sort of the breakdown. When we want a corporation or a site to be fixed, 40% of all 861 of our recommendations do that. 27% involve in enforcement groups, research, and this broad communication type recommendation. We try not to issue so many of those anymore because we can do that with just a letter, but that's one of the types of recommendations we have. So 27% of those go there. Then we've got the regulators, federal, state, and local. 12% of all of our recommendations target those groups. Most of the time it's for regulatory change, but not always. Sometimes it's for some sort of a guidance document or something like that. And then we've got recommended practices, voluntary standards, those groups, the APIs, NFPAs, ICCs, those groups that issue those. 21% of our recommendations deal with that. Now, in addition to the different groups, we also track things by implemented, when they're implemented, when they're not implemented. And so this is just an example of a piece of data that we track that, that deals with implementation by recipient type. So right now, I think that the lowest percentage is in that government group. But one of the things I always want to stick up for the government groups, not just because we're in the government, but those are typically regulatory changes. Those take a very, very long time to implement. And that's why that percentage is so low. But otherwise, you've got the unions that is 85% implemented. Other groups besides the industry, the government, the professional organizations, those are sort of the one-offs. They're almost up to 90%. And then you've got your trade organizations, and they're at 78%. And so, like I say, as far as implemented. So basically, any kind of data that describes a recommendation, we collect it, we track it. And I always like to tell some of the organizations, we never forget. With that, that concludes my presentation on the recommendations program performance and other information. And with that, I will pass it off to Chairman Limos, I believe.
Director Barkley, that was so instructive. And ever since I joined this agency in last May, more or less, you and I have been talking about the data and what you show us, and I have been so impressed by what we could do beyond the individual status change, right? So I'm just going to talk, I have a few questions for you. So impressed by that data. I think a lot of people don't understand how successful we are with closing our recommendations despite our lack of authority to mandate, because that's one of the questions I get the most, right? So I'd say that recommendations is a critical part of our mission and impact on chemical safety. And I say that in the true sense of our Clean Air Act and enabling legislation. So how you and your team have showcased selective wins over the past year, which I am so proud of, and I'm glad we do, because I think it brings home why investigations are done, what can come out of it. But during our quarterly meetings, the one constant positive feedback that I get, because we have highlighted your efforts, thanks to you, your team, and Executive Director Kleist, is that the feedback that we get is they never knew what people were being asked because it's in a different field or subfield, and they didn't understand the impact that it would have. And I've heard so many positive comments about the impact of our leading this with Executive Director Kleist and your leadership into highlighting these things. And I know Hillary Cohen has also been super instrumental. Our animations, cannot deny that. And we have some exciting ones coming out. Exciting, instructive, right? But so the range of stakeholders from business meetings have said, oh my goodness, I never understood the importance of recommendations, because it brings that home. It's like taking the football over the field, right? You can carry it to the 10-yard line, and okay, I'm not a sports expert, but you have to get it over the goalpost. Another important point that you made, but I really wanted to talk about a little more specifically, is that it brings together the expertise and complexity of investigations and recommendations experts. Because the investigators, we could not have any of the recommendations without the investigators, okay? I'm not diminishing that at all. But if without an understanding of what type of recommendation is going to be most instrumental to the different recipients of these recommendations, given their scope and capabilities and authority, then it's going to be more challenging for you and your team. You and your, I would like to be a bigger team. So I appreciate that, Dr. Vardy, because both teams require complexities of a different nature. One is in the weeds of the exact structural integrity, the chemical nature, and one is about the larger impact that it could have on the community and who could impact that change to effect chemical change. And I often get asked by our leadership, and I say leadership, it's Congress, it's Senate, it's stakeholders, but leadership really is who's funding us, is if you can't affect change or mandate change, then what is the good, right? And I know, because you work for other regulatory agencies and you understand, and I have too. I understand that there are many ways to achieve a common goal. And participants in the system always, or most always, want to do the right thing. No one wakes up saying, I'm just going to not do the right thing. Just not going to. So another thing I want to highlight is that with this data that we're developing, and this is not right, you did a great job explaining it. And there's so much more to discover that we've looked through and that we could provide to individual constituencies for the, I'm not sure I can pronounce it correctly, Kanawha Valley and Houston. But there are so many things that we can really bring together to show what is happening in that particular area. So the investment, when we show it in that way, I mean, I looked at your charts. Closed acceptably, massive, in proportionally incredible statistics regarding how many were successful. And the last chart that you had, we'll talk about in a minute too, is that change is happening and we are making it happen despite the stick that says, I'm going to punish you if you don't, right? I mean, more or less, our agency doesn't have that. So the investment is valuable. It makes a difference in the chemical safety industry and community. It shows what you have presented, and I can't tell you how much I thank you for that. It shows to our leaders and to our stakeholders why it's important to follow the recommendations and to listen to the recommendations and for us to get the recommendations on target. So I think that's really important. And as you said, it takes a commitment from both investigative side and recommendation side. You cannot separate those. They might be in different domains, they might have different overlapping experiences, but you cannot separate them. So with that, I do have a few questions. I know you didn't expect that interlude. Although I really believe that the recommendations is the take-home message of our investigation, probable cause, Probable cause is really important in getting to the bottom of it. And I can't tell you much of them, and I can't wait. I cannot wait with Director Kleiss, Executive Director Kleiss, to update the critical drivers list. But with regards to what you presented today and in general, can you tell me about the recommendations, how the recommendations have changed over the years before your tenure or during your tenure, in terms of content, scope, recipient, general nature, anything you choose to talk about? But I definitely, as I vote on these, I recognize the change. Can you talk about that?
Oh, yes, ma'am. Over the years, our recommendations have just gotten better and better and better. Now we ensure that they have a causal link with the incident, meaning that they address causal factors that allow chemical incidents to occur or progress. And as our recommendations do prevent the likelihood of reoccurrence, they've also become much more of a performance or outcome based. And that's not to say they don't have some prescriptive elements. When there are certain minimum requirements that must be addressed, we do specifically call out for something. But most of the time, like I say, we're performance-based, outcome-based. Lastly, they're more versatile. When they need to be simple, they're simple. This tends to be the case when we address issues at a facility or something like that. However, when they need to be complex, they're complex. And this happens when we propose changes to federal or state regulations or national standards and that kind of thing. So I hope that answers your question, Chairman Lemos.
Yeah, and part, you know, what always has impressed upon me coming from developing recommendations that go to you. Oops, the host has spotlighted. It looks like my video is showing, but I'm not sure we're showing. Host, do you have any questions?
May just be the camera cover on your machine may be covered.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So I know that one recommendation is not just a recommendation that's the same as the other. We're not talking about a manufacturing plant where we're producing widgets that are all the same specification. What you're saying are some are very complex, and you just mentioned that. Some are for regulation, whether it's with OSHA or EPA. Some are guidance documents from API and other NCCPS, which require 3 to 5 years of committee members committed to improving the guidance provided to the community. And I appreciate that. So yes, they're versatile. They've changed over the years. Do you agree that they've changed over the years with perhaps board member preferences, or I'm not sure how have they changed other than the topic at hand?
Well, like I said, they've gotten a lot more focused on those causal factors, like I said before, and the performance side of the house. We're looking for is an outcome. We shouldn't be directing how they actually get there and things like that. I mean, they know their programs or their regulations or their facilities far better than we would. So a lot of the times we've actually made things that are so prescriptive that they couldn't do it that way, but they could do this other thing. And so, like I said, when we get to the outcome, that's typically what we're looking for. And so we've tried to craft the recommendations a little bit more that way. Although, say if there is something very specific that we want to see, we put that in there and we make sure that's part of the recommendation implementation. That's the big thing. That, and like I said, that focus on the causal link. Focus on the causal link.
I think that's a really good thing to come back to, and I agree with that. I believe that recommendations that are really prescriptive based on the moment of time, by the time the committee gets done 3 to 5 years later, it could be a different word or something else. And your ability to adapt to alternative accepted, right? So, or exceeded. I was like really impressed by the number of ones that were exceeded, which was far more than acceptable alternative. Okay, 36 versus 21. So that was great. Okay, so the second question, with your extensive knowledge of and experience with CSB recommendations, and I know you haven't been here forever, and you're not responsible for all the greatness or you're not responsible for everything that was issued before, but I know you see it because you have to evaluate the responses to it. Is there anything in the data that would change your approach in the summary data that we've been looking at to the development of a recommendation based on the type of recipient? And I'm focusing really on the last chart you had, which was a little bit challenging, but despite federal and local, I mean, API, other guidance agencies have to spend a lot of time on these things. Some are company level and can be done quicker. But is there anything outside of that that's not specific to any one of those groups that you would change based on what you've learned?
Well, I'd say, and as you mentioned, we comb over that data very regularly, and we're always trying to mine it and see what can come out of it. But the recommendations program is very dynamic, and we've been fortunate in that we have the latitude to incorporate process safety improvement over time, when not process safety, but process improvement, when we see opportunities where they present themselves. So we've modified our processes over time to make the recommendations align more closely with each recipient's scope of responsibility and impact. In our current process, recommendation staff and investigation staff seamlessly work together to ensure that not only do we target the right recipients, and that's the first step. You got to get the right person to target. But when the situation calls for it, and knowing the recipient's capabilities, we can push their boundaries to achieve a higher level of safety than may have been originally envisioned. And when that kind of thing happens, I mean, everybody's happy. The CSB is happy, obviously. The recipients actually are tremendously proud of their action. So it's just a benefit, and of course, safety. It benefits safety above all, and that's a win for everybody.
I appreciate that, Director Harvey. It brings me to recent investigations, and I can't say that it wasn't so for previous investigations. The only recent ones that I've been involved in, integrally. We've gained some insight to the potential impact to the industry as a whole, not just for a particular community or site or particular chemical, right? And one thing that comes to mind is Aghorn, which we, completed last year. And we learned about the number of potential sites across the Permian Basin that could be subject to this level of vulnerability, and where catastrophic events could occur for whatever reasons, for the numerous reasons that we had expounded upon in the investigation in the board meeting. So my question is, if we continue on this trend, how might this change the nature of recommendations, if at all?
That is an interesting question. Let me answer this way. I think the more a recommendation is informed by data like that, and just data and information in general, the better it is from the standpoint of broad reaching impact. Every chemical incident we investigate is a tragedy. There's no other way to really describe that. But with the right focus and information provided by our investigators, the CSB has a tremendous capacity to positively drive critical chemical safety change. And that is our mission. That is what we do. So I hope that answers your question, Chairman Lewis. That was a good one.
I think you're well suited to answer that question. I think you did. What I heard from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we can't minimize the 1 or 2 fatalities or injuries, but we have to really think about the impact to the potential injuries or risk or hazard across the numerous facilities of that same type, even if it hasn't happened yet. Would you agree with that, or is that?
Yes, ma'am, I would absolutely agree with that. I think, as you said, when our investigators go out, we're dealing with people on the worst day of their life, regardless of the magnitude of the incident we're dealing with. So, yes, I do agree with that.
Director Barbie, I look forward to our developing metrics for recommendations, as I do for Executive Director Police. Thank you so much for representing and revisiting that topic and explaining why we have a dynamic nature of anticipating the end outcome product, much less date, right? So I really appreciate that. I appreciate Senior Advisor Lexert, who is working with all of this, as well as our support staff, to get us to a place where we can support the organization as a whole. And we have a long way to go, but I told someone yesterday, we are twice as effective, or twice as effective, maybe twice as capable as we were when I joined a year and a half ago. And I appreciate it, and I would not have been able to do it without any of you. And I want to also acknowledge Anna Brown, who left our agency approximately a year ago, and who worked here for 20 years. Ray Porfieri, who really, they contributed to the agency significantly. So in closing, I want to thank everybody and all the participants for their attendance to this business meeting and for your attention and support. As our HR business partners at the Department of Interior complete the onboarding of our new board members, we greatly look forward to the next meeting in which they are seated. I'm positive it will be the next quarterly meeting with product voted on by them. So we will undoubtedly be made stronger by their diverse perspectives and backgrounds. And I also want to thank my senior advisors and dedicated agency staff for their contributions here today. And I haven't named them all, but there are many people who have been here for a long time, some people who've been here for a short time, and I really appreciate all their contributions. So once again, that we must remain true to our mission in conducting and issuing independent and objective analysis and recommendations. It's really important to consider the expertise, knowledge, and priorities of our stakeholder communities, which we will continue to engage with. Please look out for our upcoming announcement of board meetings to close out investigations and our next quarterly public meeting. We anticipate scheduling the quarterly public meetings in advance, and then once we're close enough to feeling confident in investigation closure or a safety product closure, we will announce that, and we will announce that, promise you, sooner than 2 days in advance. So we look forward to that, and with that, this meeting is adjourned.